This is the Naropa Institute, June 25th, 1987, a lecture series by Philip Whalen called Writers on Writing.
Sort of as a review of an article by Walter Besant in Pall Mall Gazette. And Besant was talking about the English novel and what it was supposed to be like and so on. And among other things, James says this piece is called The Art of Fiction. And I'm reading it out of the version that's in the portable Henry James. I'm having a hell of a time seeing. I don't know whether I can do this or not. It goes without saying that you will not write a good novel unless you possess the sense of reality. But it will be difficult to give you a recipe for calling that sense into being. Humanity is immense, and reality has a myriad forms. The most one can affirm is that some of the flowers of fiction have the odor of it, and others have not. As for telling you in advance how your nosegay should be composed, that's another affair. It is equally excellent and inconclusive to say that one must write from experience. To our supposititious aspirant, such a declaration might savor of mockery. What kind of experience is intended, and where does it begin and end? Experience is never limited, and it is never complete. It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web of the finest silken threads suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue. It is the very atmosphere of the mind, and when the mind is imaginative, much more when it happens to be that of a man of genius, it takes to itself the faintest hints of life. It converts the very pulses of the air into revelations. The young lady living in a village has only to be a damsel upon whom nothing is lost to make it quite unfair, as it seems to me, to declare to her that she shall have nothing to say about the military. He's answering a point that Besant had made in his article about how a young lady in a village ought to write about being a young lady in a village. She shouldn't try to tell you about admirals or something. And James says, that's what he's answering at this point. He says there's no reason why she can't if she's one of those, what does he say? A damsel upon whom nothing is lost. To make it quite unfair, as it seems to me, to declare to her that she shall have nothing to say about the military. Greater miracles have been seen than that. Imagination assisting, she should speak the truth about some of these gentlemen. I remember an English novelist, a woman of genius, telling me that she was much commended for the impression she had managed to give in one of her tales of the nature and way of life of the French Protestant youth. She had been asked where she learned so much about this recondite being. She had been congratulated on her peculiar opportunities. These opportunities consisted in her having once in Paris, as she ascended a staircase, passed an open door wherein the household of a pasteur. Some of the young Protestants were seated at table round a finished meal. The glimpse made a picture. It lasted only a moment, but that moment was experience. She had got her direct personal impression, and she turned out her type. She knew what youth was and what Protestantism. She also had the advantage of having seen what it was to be French, so that she converted these ideas into a concrete image and produced a reality. Above all, however, she was blessed with the faculty which, when you give it an inch, takes an L and which, for the artist, is a much greater source of strength than any accident of residence or of place in the social scale. The power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern, the condition of feeling life in general so completely that you are well on your way to knowing any particular corner of it, this cluster of gifts may also be said to constitute experience, and they occur in country and in town and in the most differing stages of education. If experience consists of impressions, it may be said that impressions are experience, just as, have we not seen it? They are the very air we breathe. Therefore, if I should certainly say to a novice, quote, write from experience and experience only, I should feel that this was rather a tantalizing monition, if I were not careful immediately to add, try to be one of the people on whom nothing is lost. Be available. Keep your eyes open, your ears open, and whatnot to what's going on around. Now, and Allen suggested that I read this other thing to you, Composition as Explanation, a short essay by Stein, to give you some clearer idea of what she was after. This was written for the occasion of a visit to Oxford and Cambridge. Edith Sitwell and her brothers had arranged it for her to be invited to talk to the young people and writers and whatnot that were then at the universities. And so she made a special trip over to England, her first since the end of the First World War, and visited both Oxford and Cambridge and read this essay to the students, who were very excited by it and thought it was something really was happening, and were quite delighted, and she was delighted at their interest and so on. So this was in, she wrote this lecture in January 1926 and went to England in the spring. After giving the lecture, she read out 4 examples of her work: Preciosilla, A Saint in Seven, Sitwell, Edith Sitwell, and Jean Cocteau, 3 portraits. The lecture was first published by the Hogarth Press, London, 1926. Who was the Hogarth Press? Who knows who that was? Well, it was Leonard Woolf. Leonard and Virginia Wolfe were the Hogarth Press. Anyway, Composition as Explanation, Part 1, there is singularly nothing that makes a difference in beginning and in the middle and in ending, except that each generation has something different at which they are all looking. By this I mean so simply that anybody knows that composition is the difference which makes each and all of them then different from other generations, and this is what makes everything different. Otherwise, they are all alike, and everybody knows it because everybody says it. It is very likely that nearly everyone has been very nearly certain that something that is interesting them. Can they and do they? It is very interesting that nothing inside in them, that is, when you consider the very long history of how everyone ever acted or has felt, it is very interesting that nothing inside in them, in all of them, makes it connectedly different. By this I mean this: the only thing that is different from one time to another is what is seen, and what is seen depends upon how everybody is doing everything. What is seen depends upon how everybody's doing everything. This makes the thing we are looking at very different, and this makes what those describe it make of it. What those describe it make of it, and that is, people who write about it. It makes a composition. It composes. It confuses. It shows, it is, it looks, it likes it as it is. And this makes what is seen as it is seen. Nothing changes from generation to generation except the thing seen, and that makes composition. Lord Grey remarked that when the generals before the war talked about the war, that is to say the First World War, 1913 to 18, when they talked about the war, they talked about it as a 19th century war, although to be fought with 20th century weapons. That is because war is a thing that decides how it is to be done when it is to be done. It is prepared, and to that degree, it is like all academies. It is not a thing made by being made. It is a thing prepared. That's a very basic notion that she's going to work on. Writing and painting and all that is like that for those who occupy themselves with it and don't make it as it is made. Now, the few who make it as it is made, and it is to be remarked that the most decided of them usually are prepared just as the world around them is preparing, do it in this way. And so I, if you do not mind, I will tell you how it happens. Naturally, one does not know it happened until it is well over beginning happening. To come back to the part that the only thing that is different is what is seen when it seems to be being seen, in other words, composition and time sense. No one is ahead of his time. It is only that the particular variety of creating his time is the one that his contemporaries, who also are creating their own time, refuse to accept. And they refuse to accept it for a very simple reason, and that is that they do not have to accept it for any reason. They themselves, that is, everybody in their entering the modern composition, and they do enter it. If they do not enter it, they are not, so to speak, in it. They are out of it, and so they do enter it. But in, as you may say, the non-competitive efforts, where if you are not in it, nothing is lost except nothing at all, except what is not had. There are naturally all the refusals, and the things refused are only important unexpectedly. Somebody happens to need them. In the case of the arts, it is very definite. Those who are creating the modern composition authentically are naturally only of importance when they are dead, because by that time the modern composition, having become past, is classified, and the description of it is classical. That is the reason why the creator of the new composition in the arts is an outlaw until he is a classic. There is hardly a moment in between, and it is really too bad, very much too bad, naturally, for the creator, but also very much too bad for the enjoyer. They all really would enjoy the created so much better just after it has been made than when it is already a classic. But it is perfectly simple that there is no reason why the contemporaries should see, because it would not make any difference as they lead their lives in the new composition anyway. And as everyone is naturally indolent, why naturally they don't see. For this reason, as in quoting Lord Grey, it is quite certain that nations not actively threatened are at least several generations behind themselves militarily, so aesthetically they are more than several generations behind themselves, and it is very much too bad. It is so very much more exciting and satisfactory for everybody if one can have contemporaries, if all one's contemporaries could be one's contemporaries. There is almost not an interval. And of course, that's all different today. We have instantaneous TV coverage of everything, so that everything is contemporary, and anybody, as the late Mr. Warhol says, anybody can be famous for 15 minutes. For a very long time, everybody refuses, and then almost without a pause, almost everybody accepts. And of course, she's referring to the case of people like Picasso and Matisse and whatnot, who were put down when they were young, but who in their own lifetime became classics. In the history of the refused in the arts and literature, the rapidity of the change is always startling. Now, the only difficulty with the volte-face concerning the arts is this. When the acceptance comes, by that acceptance the thing created becomes a classic. It is a natural phenomena, a rather extraordinary natural phenomena, that a thing accepted becomes a classic. And what is the characteristic quality of a classic? The characteristic quality of a classic is that it is beautiful. Now, of course, it's perfectly true that a more or less first-rate work of art is beautiful, but the trouble is that when that first-rate work of art becomes a classic because it is accepted, the only thing that is important from then on to the majority of the acceptors, the enormous majority, the most intelligent majority of the acceptors, is that it is so wonderfully beautiful. Of course it's wonderfully beautiful, only when it is still a thing irritating, annoying, stimulating, then all quality of beauty is denied to it. And of course she's thinking of paintings like the Demoiselles d'Avignon, one of the early paintings of Picasso that was based on his take on African art, the strange ladies with pointy heads and long noses and so on. Was ridiculed and derided when it was first shown as being ugly and horrible and so on. Now we don't think anything about it. We say, oh, that's a Picasso. An early Picasso. So she says, of course, it is beautiful, but first, of course it is beautiful, but first all beauty in it is denied, and then all the beauty of it is accepted. If everyone were not so indolent, they would realize that beauty is beauty even when it is irritating and stimulating, not only when it is accepted and classic. Of course, it is extremely difficult, nothing more so, than to remember back to its not being beautiful once it has become beautiful. This makes it so much more difficult to realize its beauty when the work is being refused, and prevents everyone from realizing that they were convinced that beauty was denied once the work is accepted. Automatically, with the acceptance of the time sense comes the recognition of the beauty. And once the beauty is accepted, the beauty never fails anyone. Think about Guernica, for example. Beginning again and again is a natural thing, even when there is a series. Beginning again and again and again, explaining composition and time is a natural thing. It is understood by this time that everything is the same except composition and time. Composition and the time of the composition and the time in the composition. Everything is the same except composition, and as the composition is different and always going to be different, everything is not the same. Everything is not the same as the time when of the composition, and the time in the composition is different. The composition is different, that is certain. The composition is the thing seen by everyone living in the living that they are doing. They are the composing of the composition. That at the time they are living, the composition of the time in which they are living, it is that time that makes living a thing they are doing. Nothing else is different. Of that, almost anyone can be certain. The time when and the time of and the time in that composition is the natural phenomena of that composition, and of that perhaps everyone can be certain. No one thinks these things when they are making, when they are creating what is the composition. Naturally, no one thinks, that is, no one formulates until what is to be formulated has been made. In other words, you make the art and then you have the explanation later. Composition is not there. It is going to be there, and we are here. This is some time ago for us, naturally. The only thing that is different from one time to another is what is seen, and what is seen depends upon how everybody is doing everything. This makes the thing we are looking at very different, and this makes what those who describe it make of it. It makes it composition. It confuses. It shows. It is. It looks. It likes it as it is. And this makes what is seen as it is seen. Nothing changes from generation to generation except the thing seen, and that makes a composition. Now, the few who make writing as it is made, and it is to be remembered that the most decided of them are those that are prepared by preparing, are prepared just as the world around them is prepared and is preparing to do it in this way. And so, if you do not mind, I will again tell you how it happens. Naturally, one does not know how it happened until it is well over beginning happening. Each period of living differs from any other period of living, not in the way life is, but in the way life is conducted. And that, authentically speaking, is composition. After life has been conducted in a certain way, everybody knows it, but nobody knows it. Little by little, nobody knows it as long as nobody knows it. Anyone creating the composition in the arts does not know it either. They are conducting life, and that makes their composition what it is. It makes their work compose as it does. Their influence and their influences are the same as that of all of their contemporaries, only it must always be remembered that the analogy is not obvious until, as I say, the composition of a time has become so pronounced that it is past, and the artistic composition of it is a classic. And now to begin as if to begin. Composition is not there. It is going to be there, and we are here. This is some time ago for us, naturally. There is something to be added afterwards. Just how much of my work is known to you, I do not know. I feel that perhaps it would be just as well to tell the whole of it. In beginning writing, I wrote a book called 3 Lives. This was written in 1905. I wrote a Negro story called Melanctha. In that, there was a constant recurring and beginning. There was a marked direction in the direction of being in the present, although naturally I had been accustomed to past, present, and future. And why? Because the composition forming around me was a prolonged present. A composition of a prolonged present is a natural composition in the world as it has been these 30 years. It was more and more a prolonged present. I created then a prolonged present naturally. I knew nothing of a continuous present, but it came naturally to me to make one. It was simple, it was clear to me, and nobody knew why it was done like that. I did not myself, although naturally to me it was natural. After that, I did a book called The Making of Americans. It is a long book, about 1,000 pages. Here again, it was also natural to me, and more complicatedly, a continuous present. A continuous present is a continuous present. I made almost 1,000 pages of a continuous present. Continuous present is one thing, and beginning again and again is another thing. These are both things. And then there is using everything. This brings us again to composition, this using everything. The using everything brings us to composition, and to this composition. A continuous present and using everything and beginning again. In these 2 books, there was elaboration of the completion of using everything, and a continuous present, and of beginning again and again and again. In the first book, that is 3 Lives, there was a groping for a continuous present and for using everything by beginning again and again. There was a groping for using everything, and there was a groping for a continuous present, and there was an inevitable beginning of beginning again and again and again. Having naturally done this, I naturally was a little troubled with it when I read it. I became then like the others who read it. One does, you know, accepting that when I reread it myself, I lost myself in it again. Then I said to myself, this time it will be different, and I began. I did not begin again, I just began. In this beginning, naturally, since I at once went on and on, very soon there were pages and pages and pages, more and more elaborated creating, and more continuous present, including more and more using of everything, and continuing more and more beginning and beginning and beginning. I went on and on to 1,000 pages of it. In the meantime, to naturally begin, I commenced making portraits of anybody and anything. In making these portraits, I naturally made a continuous present and including everything and a beginning again and again within a very small thing. That started me into composing anything into one thing. So then naturally it was natural that one thing, an enormously long thing, was not everything. An enormously short thing was also not everything, nor was it all of it a continuous present thing, nor was it always and always beginning again. Naturally, I would then begin again. I would begin again. I would naturally begin. I did naturally begin. This brings me to a great deal that has been begun. And after that, what changes? What changes after that? After that, what changes? And what changes after that? And after that, and what changes? And after that, and what changes after that? The problem from this time on became more definite. It was all so nearly alike, it must be different, and it is different. It is natural that if everything is used and there is a continuous present and a beginning again and again, if it is all so alike, it must be simply different. And everything simply different has the natural way of creating it then. In this natural way of creating it then, that it was simply different, everything being alike, it was simply different, this kept on leading one to lists. Lists, naturally, for a while, and by lists I mean a series. More and more is going back over what was done at this time. I find that I naturally kept simply different as an intention. Whether there was or whether there was not a continuous present did not then any longer trouble me. There was or there was not. Using everything no longer troubled me. If everything is alike, using everything could no longer trouble me. And beginning again and again could no longer trouble me, because if lists were inevitable, if series were inevitable, and the whole of it was inevitable, beginning again and again could not trouble me. So then, with nothing to trouble me, I very completely began naturally, since everything alike, making it as simply different, naturally as simply different as possible. I began doing natural phenomena, what I call natural phenomena, and natural phenomena. Naturally, everything being alike, natural phenomena are making things be naturally simply different. This found its culmination later in the beginning. It began in a center confused with lists, with series, with geography, with returning portraits, and with particularly often 4 and 3, and often with 5 and 4. It is easy to see that in the beginning, such a conception as everything being naturally different would be very inarticulate, and very slowly it began to emerge and take the form of anything. And then naturally, if anything that is simply different, What follows will follow. So far, then, the progress of my conception was the natural progress entirely in accordance with my epoch, as I am sure it is to be quite easily realized if you think over the scene that was before us all from year to year. As I said in the beginning, there is the long history of how everyone ever acted or has felt, and that nothing inside in them, in all of them, makes it completely different. By this I mean all this. The only thing that is different from one time to another is what is seen, and what is seen depends upon how everybody's doing everything. It is understood by this time that everything is the same except composition and time. Composition and the time of the composition and the time in the composition. Everything is the same except composition, and as the composition is different and always going to be different, everything is not the same. So then, I was a contemporary creating the composition in the beginning, was groping toward continuous present, a using everything, a beginning again and again, and then everything being alike, then everything, very simply, everything was naturally, simply different, and so I, as a contemporary, was creating everything being alike, was creating everything naturally being naturally, simply different, everything being alike. This, then, was the period that brings me to the period of the beginning of 1914. Everything being alike, everything naturally would be simply different, and war came, and everything being alike and everything being simply different brings everything being simply different, brings it to romanticisms. Romanticism is then when everything being alike, everything is naturally simply different, and romanticism. This, for 4 years, this was more and more different, even though this was everything alike. Everything alike, naturally, everything is and was war. Everything being alike, everything naturally, everything is different, simply different, naturally, simply different. And so there was the natural phenomena that was war, which had been, before war came, several generations behind the contemporary composition. Because it became war and so completely needed to be contemporary, became completely contemporary, and so created the completed recognition of the contemporary composition. Everyone but one may say everyone became aware of the existence of the authenticity of the modern composition. This then, the contemporary recognition, because of the academic thing known as war, having been forced to become contemporary, made everyone not only contemporary in act, not only contemporary in thought, but contemporary in self-consciousness, made everyone contemporary with the modern composition. And so the art creation of the contemporary composition, which would have been outlawed normally, outlawed several generations more behind even than the war having been brought, so to speak, up to date, art, so to speak, was allowed not completely to be up to date, but nearly up to date. In other words, we who created the expression of the modern composition were to be recognized before we were dead, some of us even quite a long time before we were dead. And so war may be said to have advanced a general recognition of the expression of the contemporary composition by almost 30 years. And of course she's referring to not only to painting, but to poets like Guillaume Apollinaire and the other experimental poets that came along in those years. And Jean Cocteau was still young and cutting up and having a great time, and a number of Erik Satie was making all sorts of new music. Stravinsky was operating and so on.
Do you know Apollinaire's real name? I know in that Kerouac.
Oh, it's Kostrovsky or something like that. It was, yeah, but it was, he was not some such name with a Kostrovich or something like that. The man wasn't married to his mother, and so he wasn't really entitled to this name. And so he never used it much anyway. He just became Guillaume Apollinaire.
But it was actually like someone who was married to his mother's name, Apollinaire?
Yeah, he was registered, I guess, when he was born, under the name of Kostrovich or Kostrovsky, whatever it was.
I always suspected that name as being like overly romantic, and then in the Kerouac interview you referred to the other day, Kerouac said that's not his real name when they talked about Apollinaire, and I just...
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So let's see. Well, I wish I could see better. It's really difficult. Now, after that, there is no more of that. In other words, there is peace, and something comes, and it follows coming then. And so now, one finds oneself interesting oneself in an equilibration. Equilibration. That, of course, means words as well as things, and distribution as well as between themselves, between the words and themselves, and the things and themselves, a distribution as distribution. This makes what follows, and now there is every reason why there should be an arrangement made. Distribution is interesting, and equilibration is interesting, when a continuous present and a beginning again and again, and using everything, and everything alike, and everything naturally simply different, has been done. After all this, there is that. There has been that. There is a composition, and that nothing changes except composition. The composition and the time of and the time in the composition. The time of the composition is a natural thing, and the time in the composition is a natural thing. It is a natural thing, and it is a contemporary thing. The time of the composition is the time of the composition. It has been at times a present thing. It has been at times a past thing. It has been at times a future thing. It has been at times an endeavor at parts or all of these things. In my beginning, it was a continuous present, a beginning again and again and again and again. It was a series. It was a list. It was a similarity and everything different. It was a distribution and an equilibration. That is all of the time, some of the time of the composition. Now, there is still something else, the time sense in the composition. This is what is always a fear, a doubt, and a judgment, and a conviction. The quality in the creation of expression, the quality in a composition that makes it go dead just after it has been made, is very troublesome. The time in the composition is a thing that is very troublesome. If the time in the composition is very troublesome, it is because there must, even if there is no time at all in the composition, there must be time in the composition, which is in its quality of distribution and equilibration. In the beginning, there was the time in the composition that naturally was in the composition, but time in the composition comes now, and this is what is now troubling everyone. The time in the composition is now a part of distribution and equilibration. In the beginning, there was confusion. There was a continuous present, and later there was romanticism, which was not a confusion, but an extrication. And now there is either succeeding or failing. There must be distribution and equilibration. There must be time that is distributed and equilibrated. This is the thing that is at present the most troubling. And if there is the time that is at present the most troublesome, the time sense that is at present the most troubling is the thing that makes the present the most troubling. There is at present, there is distribution. By this I mean expression and time. And in this way, at present, composition is time. That is the reason that at present the time sense is troubling. That is the reason why at present the time sense in the composition is the composition that is making what there is in composition. And afterwards, now that is all. And of course, at the time this was written in 1926, Mrs. Wolfe was worrying about the same thing. Mr. Proust was also in the mid-career of writing Remembrance of Things Past. And then Mr. Einstein had come on in 1905 or so to tell us that time was relative. There's no such thing, no such real object, that time depends on space and other coordinates. And so depending on where you're at and what you're doing, there's more or less time and whatnot. We think of it as real. But for example, it is now 8 o'clock here, and in New York it's 10 o'clock. Well, think how different you feel at 10 o'clock than you do at 8 o'clock. It's all simultaneous. It's very interesting. And if you were watching a television program being broadcast from New York, you would think it was happening right now, but of course it isn't. It's 2 hours later. Allen said, I didn't understand Gertrude Stein until you read me that essay. He says, and then I got interested in it, and I could see that she was after something, or she was doing something, and started investigating. I don't know how much investigating he did, but in any case, the first of her books that I got was called Narration. It's a bunch of lectures that she gave at the University of Chicago when she was on a lecture tour of America in about 1935, something like that, 34, somewhere along in there. And it really set me off because her ideas about writing and about what writing is about and how you do it was very interesting to me, and it encouraged me a great deal to go ahead and do whatever I could and not worry too much about what it looked like. And so I filled a notebook. I had been writing before I read that in a notebook, writing lots of poems in lots of different ways and manners and decorations and styles and whatnot. But after reading Narration, and then shortly after that reading the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which really delighted me, I experimented more, throwing words around. But then I relapsed later after I got out of the Army and was at college. I went back into kind of imagist poetry, sort of 1920s Amy Lowell, Ezra Pound, Eliot kind of imagery. And all of us had a hard time in those years, say from 1946 to 1951 when I was still in school, because it seemed everybody had already created everything that was worth talking about, that Yeats had happened and that Pound and Eliot and Williams and Rilke and Lorca and any number of other people had really sewed up the poetry world completely. And so where did we have a look in at all? And so that we would write things and then show them to each other and say, well, it's pretty good, but it ain't Yeats. or when are you going to stop doing that terrible Pound number or something like that? But it was toward the end of those years that I broke myself loose from it, or started breaking myself loose from it pretty well by writing a long poem in the manner of the four quartets, and it was called The Temptation of St. Anthony. It went on about many pages. It was quite wonderful. And a section of it was printed in the college literary magazine. But anyhow, I found out how to make that sound that Eliot was making. And I also, happily, from reading some commentary, perhaps F.O. Matheson, reading some book about Eliot, that I found out where he was getting his stuff. He was swiping it all from Apollonaire. And so I went and looked at the people that, beside Apollonaire, also Jules Laforgue and who else? There was one other lunatic in there that Pound had talked about. And so I looked these people up, and I can sort of read French with the help of 7 or 8 dictionaries, one word at a time. And so I thought, aha, poor Tom's a cold. He wasn't so marvelously original and what I wanted to write, or what I thought was interesting or important or not, or what. Anyway, I went ahead and wrote a book of poems as my bachelor's thesis project. It's not a very good book, but anyway, it's quite various, and it doesn't sound like Tom Eliot, and it doesn't sound like Yeats. It's starting to sound sort of like me. And I preserved one poem out of that and put it in Don Baer's head, the one called The Roadrunner, which is an example of the kind of short, tight, nervous poetry that I was writing before I started kind of breaking out of things. But it took about another 4 years of writing a whole lot and being very discouraged and very sad till I got around to saying, what the hell, I've got to get my work done, and just took off and kept writing. And then right about that time I met Allen and Kerouac and Corso, which it was a big shot in the arm. Here were these other people who had the same problem. And even Jack, although Jack had published his first novel several years earlier and was having a terrible time trying to get on the road through the press while Malcolm Cowley was inserting thousands of commas, he says, and periods and things that they didn't need. And but we were all concerned, exactly like Stein says, about what is composition and what is literally, what are we seeing now? What are we looking at? And how are we seeing it? And what do we think about it? How are we going to write about it in some very direct, really powerful, individual way? And so we would argue and fuss, and Kerouac came on with his, came developing his spontaneous prose rules and so on, which were published later in the Evergreen Review. And Allen was saying, it's got to be wild, you know, it's got to, and he was reinventing the long line that belongs to Blake and Christopher Smart and half a dozen other people. But in any case, using it, I mean, making something new out of that, taking that and shaking it and making it work in a different way completely, that nobody had ever made it work like that before. And a lot of the rhythmical and metrical and auditory whoopies that go on in the Howl poem are, when you look at them, an extension of Manly Hopkins, of all people. If you think about Hopkins's work, and what Hopkins was doing with sound and line length and marking stresses into printed versions of his poems and all that, so you would hear him. Hopkins, of course, was a musician as well as a writer and a Jesuit and so on. But he just was one of the first ones, apparently, to sort of go crazy with the language and revive all sorts of weird ancient English words, and at the same time in some sort of new form. And he of course had this heavy classical education in Greek and Latin, and so he knew classical poetry backwards and forwards, and could discuss. Several of his friends were Greek scholars, and he wrote various things from time to time about problems in Greek philology, among other things that he discussed, music and everything else. And all this was fermenting around in his head at a time, you know, when Yeats was still deep in the Celtic twilight, and Hardy was writing those strange, lumpy poems, some of which are quite good. But the standard of stuff going on in England at that era, say around the early 1900s, was pretty dim. About the time that Pound landed in London, the literary scene was pretty well tied down and full of fog and smoke and bubbles and so on. And so he kind of got the people that he met excited again about the possibilities of coming at poetry from the imagist angle, and also with always this reference backwards to the classics, and saying, look, the classics are clear and exact and beautiful and full of these plain statements and plain images. Why don't we do that? We can do that in English. Let's figure out a way to make poetry shine and glow and sparkle instead of going ta-dum, 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 another sonnet or whatever, or another fake ballad. Is anybody there? Cried the highwayman, etc. And the Edwardian poets were pretty much in command, and not Edwardian, I mean the Georgian poets, who were all fairly dull people, being published by Harold Monroe. Although some of them had a certain charm, I guess, or at least Hilda Doolittle thought so, because she married one of the chief ones of them, although it came to a sticky finish. Because he was in love with D.H. Lawrence, and by correspondence anyway. It was all very hard. And poor H.D. was heartbroken, finally. Anyway, through what Mr. Pound so accurately calls all the fug and stink of Victorian poetry, they started cutting it up and trying to make it new, as he called it, make it new. And so this say was Pound arrived in England about 1910, something like that, and left in 1920. But by 1910, Stein had already done 3 Lives, The Making of Americans, a long gay book, many, many women, and had written things like Tender Buttons from about 1914, 1918, along in there, which was a real, totally new, nutty way of writing, and which drove everybody nuts that looked at it. Everybody hated it, made fun of it in the newspapers and whatnot. And yet, she says, they make fun of me, all right, but they always quote me correctly, which is very nice. Anyhow, she was busy in Paris at a time when lots and lots of other people were, and of course she knew Hemingway when he was quite young and encouraged him, and many, many other people, and she admired Fitzgerald enormously and thought he was wonderful, and he was bashful and shy and thought she was wonderful, and so on. She knew 500 different writers and painters and so forth, and had this big collection of post-impressionist art, starting in with a couple of Gauguin and some Cézanne paintings, and then working on out through Matisse and Picasso and Juan Gris, anybody who was anybody in that time, she collected them. And whenever her rich cousins came over from Baltimore, she'd take them over to Picasso's house and make him buy a massive drawing so that Picasso could eat once in a while. Anyway, it was all a very exciting time. You can read about that in the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. There's Random House published a selected writings of Gertrude Stein, edited by Carl Van Vechten, I think it was. But it's available still in paperback, and it reprints all of Alice B. Toklas. It reprints this essay I just read, Composition as Explanation. It reprints The Gradual Making of Americans, which is her essay about writing the making of Americans, the 1,000-page book. And then examples of other writing, the play called Four Saints and Three Acts that was made into an opera by Virgil Thompson, a number of other plays, and then some later works. This book, which was edited, this is an English job done by a woman called Patricia Mierwitz contains almost the complete no, not really. It has composition as explanation, and then it has 1, 2, 3, 5 lectures out of Lectures in America, and then the separate lecture, What Are Masterpieces and Why There Are So Few of Them. And then there are portraits, from Tender Buttons, and then portraits of people, a couple of plays, and then the book that's called Before the Flowers of Friendship Faded, Friendship Faded. She started translating poems from French by a friend of hers called Jenet, and she found it a fascinating business to be translating out of French into English, and French poetry at that. But she just took off and started writing it. It didn't matter what Mr. Genet's text was, and he was rather flabbergasted at the result. And anyway, that's why it was called Before the Flowers of Friendship Faded, Friendship Faded. Wonderful idea. Anyway, that's in here complete. And then there are selections from Foreign America, the Henry James section from Foreign America, and then 5 essays about money, the short novel called Ida, and then all of her very last book, which is called Brucey and Willie, about the GIs in the Second World War. So it's a very nice collection. But if you have that, and if you have the Random House one, that has the Picasso portrait of Stein reproduced on the cover, you have quite a wad of her stuff, cheap. But the reprint of Lectures in America now goes for something like $12 and change. It's too expensive. And there's a recent reprint of Blood on the Dining Room Floor, which was a mystery story that she wrote in the 30s. And then there's a little collection of the Yale series of hitherto unprinted writings of Gertrude Stein. That they did about 7 volumes hardback of the stuff that's in the American Collection Library up in the big library at Yale. At one point I got to visit Donald Gallup, and who showed me stuff of some manuscripts of Stein that I wanted to look at. It was very exciting, and he had stuff. There were a few of pictures that had belonged to Stein hanging in his office, and all sorts of other stuff. It was very, very delightful visit. I thought it was marvelous. It was a great relief to, after having come through the lobby of the library, where they had not one but 2 Gutenberg Bibles on display. I thought that was a little bit like conspicuous consumption or something. And then you have this pass, and you show it to the elevator man, and he takes you and tells you where to go and so on. But anyway, I've always got a kick out of Stein's wrong-headedness or whatnot, and I always liked what she says about writing and how to do it. In What Are Masterpieces, in Composition as Explanation, in the book called Narration, in Lectures in America, and to some extent in the book called The Geographical History of America, or the Relationship Between Human Nature and the Human Mind. It's quite a title. But I found it all stimulating and made me think about what are you doing? What are we up to? How do we do it? And so on. So anyway, that's why I'm laying this trip on you. I brought a whole bunch of books with me, and I thought I would also read out of Virginia Wolfe's journals, because she talks about what she felt like when she was writing and when she was getting some idea for a book. Like she says, today saw. She doesn't say it was as if, but she says, I saw a fin far out in the ocean, far out at sea, a fin passed by. And she knew then that she had the waves packed in the back of her head someplace, and it was going to come out sometime or other. And so she tells later about more working on the thing and what all she was going to, how she was going to handle it and so on. So it's quite marvelous. And then, of course, there's in other parts of the journal, she tells about working on To the Lighthouse and what it was like to be remembering her parents. She had this real vivid recollection of her father and mother, who become Mr. and Mrs. Ransom in To the Lighthouse, and her own brothers and sisters and half-brothers and so on, who become characters in the book. And some of her father's students from Cambridge, I think it was, who would come and stay with the Stephen family at their summer house in Cornwall, down at the very far west end of England, out by the ocean. And the lighthouse is still there that she wrote about. It's called, St. Ives, I think. Anyhow, I like very much her feeling about the difficulty of writing, and also the pleasure and excitement of writing. Of course, she couldn't do very much because she'd get going with something, and then she would get one of her headaches and be incapacitated for 6 weeks or something, and be too ill to do anything, and then she'd start over again and get it going. But then what would happen is she'd get invited to some party, and so she'd go to a couple of parties in London instead of working, and then her nerves would shatter, and she'd be bedridden for another couple of months, and then she'd come out of that very slowly and start in writing again on what she was trying to write. So it was remarkable that she was able to do what she did, which is to say, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7 good-sized novels, 4 volumes of essays that which were originally published in the London Times Literary Supplement, which come out under the title of the Common Reader, Second Common Reader, what is it called? Something like Moths, something about moths, and the Captain's Deathbed, and so anyway, those were the original volume titles, but now they've just simply been collected into 4 paperback volumes by Cato and Windus in London, and happily I discovered this set on the shelves of a bookstore in Kyoto and immediately glommed it. I think now that that stuff is available in the United States in paperback. I'm not sure, but I think most of it is. From Harcourt, I think, who was her regular publisher here. But her take on it was from memory and from exact observation of what was in front of her, and from her own madness. She was able to use her lunacy somehow to write what she wanted to write, because it got her detached from where everybody else was at, and giving her a very individual view of whatever she was seeing, and making something out of it, and really nailing it down. Nobody could, and so that her descriptions of things and people and whatnot are very vivid and very real. And then the way she turns the language, her turns of speech and in writing and so on, is very beautiful to me. I know some people say, "Oh, it's too fancy," or "It's too high, too much associated with the upper classes," or "It's Mandarin prose," or something like that. I think that's nonsense. I can read it with great pleasure. And she was clearly one of the brightest women of modern times. If you read her letters and read her complete journals, all this is available now in paperback editions from Harcourt. We have all of this material. You can see where her head was going when it was going. It was really sharp. And of course, her husband was a very smart man, Leonard Woolf, a very interesting guy who had been at school with half of the intelligentsia of England, the people like Lord Keynes and Bertrand Russell and God knows who all else were friends of his, Lytton Strachey and many, many others. And they were all sort of disciples of G.E. Moore and his funny ethical philosophy. But Virginia Woolf was able to hold her own in this group because although she was self-educated, she never went to any school. She was educated at home, and she was turned loose on her father's library, and Sir Leslie Stephen had an enormous library. He was the man who invented the DNB, the Dictionary of National Biography. And a very funny man. He was also a mountain climber, and he knew people like Mummery and Whymper and whatnot who did a lot of the real dangerous first climbs in the Alps, and he climbed in the Alps himself. But he ends up for a long time operating the Cornhill magazine, and of course publishing Henry James, who was a friend of his. And Mrs. Woolf remembers James from when she was a little girl, and then later when she was grown up, she visited him several times while he was still alive. He died in 1916. And so she sort of knew him for quite a long time. And she wrote very sympathetically about his work from time to time, but she didn't really like it, I don't think. But she wrote very perceptively about it, and you can read her notions about him in her essays. I thought that also that I would get you into thinking about Whitman's prefaces, the various prefaces to the various editions of Leaves of Grass, but I figured, well, Allen probably has gassed everybody up on that, and so you have probably heard enough about that particular trip. And I wanted to, although I don't like Rilke, I think that his little book called The Letters to a Young Poet is very useful, and of course it's very breathy and very up and passionate and wild, and this kid is writing to him, kid in the army is writing letters to Rilke about what I got this problem with this poem. And Rilke gives him all these pep talks, they're really terrific about how great it is to be a poet and what it all is about and so on. And I first read that book when I was in the army, and I was about the same age that Mr. Kapus was when he was getting those letters from, when he was in the army in Austria in the First World War, and writing to Rilke. And so it meant a great deal to me at the time to read this book. At that time they were translated by M.D. Herter Norton, but now there's a new translation now by Stephen Mitchell, which I'm reading. I haven't tried to look at that for many years, and it's like sort of like too much whipped cream. But still, the feeling of it is very nice, and that he was so completely concerned with how do you do poetry? What is poetry about? How does it work? So on. Although, as I say, the sensibility, there's a sticky, yucky sensibility there that I don't like. And I've read translations of his letters. There are 2 volumes of letters, mostly addressed to German noblewomen to whom he's being extremely sweet, because they keep inviting him to dinner or to stay at their castles or whatnot. And I have not yet read the volume that was recently published of his letters to his letters about Cézanne. I understand that it's really hot stuff from everybody. Was it? I thought it was Cézanne that he was talking about, this batch. Although there is a batch of letters to Rodin, it's true. But I think this one is about Cézanne. And but I haven't read the thing, so I don't know whether to recommend it or not for any purpose. But certainly you should know his poetry, even though you don't like it, or even though I don't like it, and even though I think it's just totally lumpy, because I can't read German. I did finally, a friend of mine finally laid a copy of the poems, all the collected poems in German, so I could look at the German text anyway and see what it sounds like, and got a little more friendly with the stuff, but it's still just not my dish. You know, I mean, some people like spinach and some people like artichokes. So I am not saying that the guy is no good or whatnot. It's just that I'll take vanilla. So, but anyway. I'd kick him in the ass. I'd say, come on, kid. Take this stuff away. I don't want to hear about it. All about the Virgin Mary and about goodness knows what all. About he has, as I was telling somebody the other day, though, he had one good line. He has that very short poem called On an Antique Torso of Apollo, or an Antique Statue of Apollo. And he has this big take on the thing. He's standing there, and pretty soon the thing starts glowing, or the sunshine comes out of it or something, and then this voice hits him. You must change your life. And you know, that's a Sakola message. I mean, at least he got that across pretty clearly. The novel Malta Lordsbrygge, the journal, or Malta Lordsbrygge, whatever they call it, is very interesting in that it reminds you so much of Paul Valéry's Monsieur Test, or that it reminds you of Les Faux Monnayiers of André Gide, or even to some degree of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, or somewhat of Thomas Mann's short thing called Tonio Kruger. This expression, well, throw in also that long novel by Robert Musil, that awful Viennese guy, what is it called? Anyway, that funny sensibility, or the funny take on the world that all of those things are working with, is interesting, because it's right on the edge of breaking through into something that they couldn't quite pull off, and it took Hemingway and Maddox Ford and Pound and Stein and Faulkner to jerk the rug out from all these people and move it ahead. The nearest, the guy nearest to moving it ahead for a long time was, of course, Louis Ferdinand Saline, who was the man who wrote The Voyage to the End of the Night and Death on the Installment Plan and whatnot. And Henry Miller picked up on him, and that's how come Miller's books, or the big novels, were written the way they were. They were sort of taking off from Saline. And I thought that was pretty dernier cri until about 1947, when a friend of mine who was a merchant seaman came back from a trip and handed me a copy of Jean Genet's Querelle de Brest, which was a real revelation in new sensibility or whatnot. Here was French prose of the most elegant kind, solid writing right on the page, and it's not moving off the page 1 inch, however dreadful or disgusting the subject matter might have been. The the writing, the composition, the design of the book, and so on. And you have to look up every other word in an argot dictionary, because it's all slang. But the composition of it and the sentences and the paragraphing and whatnot are extremely exact and extremely heavy. Marvelous thing. And then the thing that cut that, of course, is Burroughs. Burroughs went right over the top of that whole scene and broke everything down. Jumped all the fences. Anyway, that's my take on one of the things that has happened. There was a time when I was still in school that I started reading, well, actually it was when I was still in the Army, I started reading all of Faulkner, and then I continued. And then while I was in that process, the collected short stories was published, and so I was able to read them. And that did me a lot of good. I'm not quite certain why, but anyway, there's here again is a very special sensibility working, and this enormous vocabulary, and this total extravagance, total self-indulgence, where he just raves and rants much more exactly, much more precisely than Wolfe did. Thomas Wolfe, of course, raved and ranted, but it sounds sort of cross between the Elizabethans and Damon Runyon, and it doesn't really stick so good. Whereas Faulkner nails it down over and over again with exact detail, exact image, exact picture, exact smell, taste, touch, and so on. Go right on that page. And as you read, you can't stop. When you get into this thing and get into his rhythm of composition, and it's really a trip. And so you get involved with these people that he's writing about. And I remember it was when I was stationed up here at Peterson Field at Colorado Springs that I found a copy of The Hamlet at a bookstore in that town, which had been published about 1940, I think. But this bookstore hadn't been able to sell it until I came along in 1945, and that, of course, became the first volume of this great trilogy, The Hamlet, The Mansion, and The Town, this enormous, long story about how the Snopeses came to Jefferson and wrecked the whole scene, and were wrecked by it also, in a way. But the other, I think the first thing I read of his was, of course, Sanctuary, because it was easily available. And in spite of his saying that he wrote it to make money and to be horrifying and so forth, it has some marvelous stuff in it. And shortly after the war, they reprinted The Sound and the Fury, which was his favorite book, the one that he really believed in the most. And I still think it's really a terrific book. Again, you have the time problem in there. He says that he wrote the story 5 times over because he couldn't get it down to where he wanted it. And so the time sequence of the story is all looped. The time in the composition, like Stein says, is all going in curlicues and loops and so forth, and so it makes it very difficult to read. The first section of the book is literally a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, but it does signify a whole bunch of things. And Benji is his name, and it's seen, everything is seen through his eyes, and he has no way of telling what it is he's seeing. The author tells you what he sees, but Benji can make not any sense out of it because he's a lunatic, he's an idiot, he's retarded, like we say nowadays. And so this is very hard to get into. And then the next section is about one of the brothers in this family, and about the sister who ran away, and about the other brother who had taking care of her illegitimate child and had stolen the money that his sister was putting out for it, and the child grows up and finds it and knows where that money is and goes and steals it and runs away, and leaving her uncle in a blind fury because he can't drive very far in an automobile because he's allergic to gasoline fumes, but he does it anyway, and it always gives him a headache and makes him mad, but he can't get her. She gets clear away. And the other brother goes, they sell a big part of their holdings, land holdings, in order to send this boy to Harvard. And he's in such a state of confusion about his sister and about himself and whatnot that he finally kills himself, drowns himself. And but this is all completely bitched and wound up and torn up into little pieces. And it's quite hard to read, but you really get something if you pay attention to the thing. And it's the same difficulty that one has reading Ulysses, where you really have to just stop doing everything and read it. First time I read Ulysses was on a train going from South Dakota to California. And I was on the train about 4 days or something like that. So I didn't do anything but read Ulysses for the first time around. I thought, my goodness, I wonder what that's all about. So then I had to read lots and lots of history, and even though I'm a person of Irish extraction, I know nothing whatever about Irish history or whatnot. So I had to find out I knew that there was a movie about Parnell in which Clark Gable played the part of Parnell and everything, which I either had or hadn't seen when I was a kid. But I mean, who these other Irish politicians were, or who was Michael Davitt, or who was anybody in Irish politics, not to mention who was anybody in the history of the Catholic Church, etc., which was a great concern to him. And there's a whole bunch of the church history inserted into Ulysses. And then finally, about what is Dublin like and what is Ireland like. And I had to do a lot of research. And then read the book a couple more times to get into it and enjoy it. And it is worth it. I mean, it really stays there. It doesn't go away. You can use it. Although the style is so cranky that if you get into trying to imitate that, you make yourself very nervous and you make ugliness, I think. There is one man, there were two men. One man was a Canadian called Malcolm Lowery, who was able to employ some of that technique in writing his best book called Under the Volcano. It has a lot of reminiscences of Joycean phrases and constructions in it, because he's working from European literature. And the other guy is an American called William Gaddis, who wrote two very long books, one called The Recognitions and one called J.R., and which are remarkable books. But you know, he took Joyce's technique to do the first one, and then he was building more on his own when he wrote J.R., and then his last book called Carpenter Gothic is really remarkable because he does all of the things he does in the long books, but he does it in this much space. It's just really scary how he is able to compress all of those insane conversations and annotations about American society and these characters, where they're at and what they're like, and the surround that they're operating in, namely some Hudson Valley town, and what all goes on and what all happens. And it's really terrific. He got to, was it last year, 2 years ago, he got one of those MacArthur Foundation awards, and he deserved every goddamn nickel of it. And it's a good thing. The last one was called Carpenter Gothic. The first one was called The Recognitions. And the second book is just called J.R. It's about a little kid who contrives at one point to practically take over the American Stock Exchange and wrecks the lives of a great many people and various factories in the Middle West and banks and other places and whatnot all come apart because of the operations of this little guy who found out that if you get some dud stock from a magazine ad and start trading it somehow or another, or figuring out some way of selling it, or figuring out some way of dealing it, pretty soon you get this great paper empire building up. And he did it because they took him on a field trip. He's like a little kid is like 12, 13 years old or less. He goes on a field trip down to the city to visit the stock exchange, and he takes one look at it and has it figured out. And so it tells all these repercussions in the school board in the town where he's going to school. Washington, D.C., how various individuals in high places panic out there, and New York is stood on its ear and whatnot before they finally catch up with him. It's really very funny, but at the same time very painful, because it tells the story of some of the people who are hurt by this number and what happens to them. And boy, that's a very hard, very tough thing. And of course, in Carpenter Gothic, there's a murder. It's a totally senseless murder, which is very hard to take by the time it happens, and it's really a heavy trip. On a whole different bend,